What if is an interesting question that's been tackled throughout the history of literature and fiction. It's a question that bothers and sticks with people in the real world every time they pass by a car accident on their way to work and they wonder, what if that had been me? And what if I had left 10 minutes earlier? What if I was the one who was in this situation, or what if things went differently? That's one of the reasons why Marvel's What If comics and also Marvel's What If television series on Disney Plus were so interesting, is because they tackled that question with pop culture icons, characters and heroes like Daredevil, Spider-Man, The Punisher, The Avengers. It wasn't just one scenario. It was a large plethora of worlds that asked the question, what if this happened to this person? What would have gone differently? The comics established a rich history of this question, and so when we were actually told that they were going to be adapting this sort of what-if storyline for the MCU, it was a very fascinating time in the, superhero fandom, in the community, of wondering what if stories would be adapted, if any, or what different takes they could give on the MCU. We've talked a lot about rejected and canceled media on this channel. It's something I love, and today I wanted to take a look at that series and talk about a rejected concept for the MCU's What If. So, if you enjoy this, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content. This is one of my favorite series that we talk about, the rejected media one. So, I hope to see you around for more in the future. Speaking on the post-credit podcast, What If head writer A.C. Bradley actually talked about a bunch of different canceled or rejected What If pitches that never made their way onto the screen. One of them actually was going to apparently accidentally spoil a huge part of Guardians of the Galaxy 3's plot that was already outlined at the time, so that was never actually brought to fruition. But there were others too that were deemed too dark for the PG-13 rating of the show. One such episode was actually going to tackle the idea of Peter Parker turning into a real spider and the body horror and the emotional horror that would go along with that concept. Now, those of you who have watched What If know we did get a slightly horror-themed What If episode with Spider-Man being more of a zombie hunter, but it wasn't the same as this concept. Now, the quote reads as follows. There was a couple of episodes that were just a little too dark. There was an original What If comic run, I believe, where Spider-Man turns into a real spider, and that was just too dark and too body horror for their PG-13. But it was a blast. You said it yourself. We were basically given the keys to the toy store. Go have fun and make sure everything was different. Don't give us 10 of the same. Give us 10 of the most different stories you can come up with. What's interesting about this story itself is that no more information was actually given. Ironically, when it comes to canceled or rejected media, we're not given much information from really any company because no one wants to ask that same what if question of what if they made something different. This question usually leads to backlash in online communities. Look at things like even the Restore the Snyderverse movement, where the very question of what if Zack Snyder had stayed has created thousands and thousands of people who really want to see that vision come back to the screen. A lot of the times these movements are a disruption or an inconvenience to the company above the creators who make these things. So most of the time, the information is kept scarce. What's interesting about this storyline, though, is that there is actually a large plethora of comics and also previous existing source material that does answer the question of what if Spider-Man became a spider, something that would have been very interesting to see on the screen itself. Now, some of these questions are answered in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, where actually we got to see the man spider. It's supposedly the final evolution of Spider-Man's spider powers coming to fruition. There was an entire storyline around that with Dr. Kirk Connors, Peter Parker, and others. There have been other storylines where Peter Parker went through transformations that made him more spider-like. A very famous example from when I was younger was actually around the time of the Avengers Disassembled storyline. We got to see in the comics the Spider-Man Disassembled storyline, where Spider-Man was actually turned into a spider himself. Spider-Man became a spider after a confrontation with a villain, and then eventually he burst out of the spider as a man again. Now, this ended up being sort of a big roundabout excuse for Marvel to give Spider-Man organic web fluid that his body produced to sort of copy the route that the Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi movies had taken. This is something that we've seen throughout comics history as well, where comic books sort of mold to match the look or feel of the movies and then operate as almost a propaganda piece for the movie, or almost as an advertisement to get people to see the movie. Now, this is what happened in Spider-Man Disassembled when Spider-Man eventually came back with his organic web fluid, but in the meantime, it was pretty sad. It was a very sad story where the implication was that Spider-Man was stuck as this spider, that he was no longer going to be a person, that he was more of a creature with the previous feelings, thoughts, and emotions of Peter Parker stuck inside of him. That did eventually change, like we said, but it is something that was very, very horror-inducing at the time. There have been other questions asked with Spider-Man that have been very interesting throughout the What If series, including the question of what if Spider-Man had rejected the offer of the spider totems, if he had never actually come back to life after Spider-Man the Other in the comics, and had instead refused, eventually joining together with the Venom symbiote to create Poison, which was another dark and depressing storyline that eventually led to Peter Parker confronting his own family, being pretty much exiled by them because of how he had become a monster, and then actually raising Gwen Stacy from the dead to become a mate for him now. My point that I'm getting at with all of this is that What If has a very, very long history of being horror inspired. A lot of the questions of What If are not innocent, simple questions. Some of them are. Some of them are very innocuous and don't really matter. However, a lot of the questions in the What If comics were very, very dark questions. What if Peter Parker rejected the offer of the spider totem and instead came back as a zombie-like symbiote-covered being who then raised his years-dead girlfriend from the dead to turn her into a mate for himself? That's pretty dark stuff for a comic book, especially for a TV show. And the other questions, too, of Peter Parker just becoming the spider itself, also very dark and graphic, which is why we wouldn't see something like this actually appear on the screen. But I do believe that with the horror background that the What If comics have, it does do a disservice to the fans of this property, of these stories, to not introduce that in some way. There are light elements of it with different characters in the first season of Marvel's What If. However, I don't think they actually ever go to the extents that the comic book did. The extents of darkness, the extents of what if this horrible thing happened? How would the world move on? That's a question that the What If comics asked more often than not. It's interesting to me because A.C. Bradley did go on to say that it was less about being reeled back in from crazier stories. It was more of them stopping us from walking into one of the movies and destroying that. So, even though this example obviously was being reeled back from a crazier story that would have been more dark than Disney likely wanted to see on the screen, most of the rejected pitches for Marvel's What If were things like the Guardians of the Galaxy Part 3 accidental spoilers, where they just didn't want to ruin their movie ahead of time with a What If episode and essentially just make it again in live action. It's interesting to think about, what if we had gotten this episode? What would this season have looked like? I think a lot of people found the Spider-Man episode of What If to be fairly fine, as the kids would say, mid. Now, I really do think that, adding my own spin on things and my own opinion here, at some point, because we do know this show is coming back for a season 2, at some point if this show sticks around, it needs to get used to what it is. I don't think that Disney and Marvel can have their cake and eat it too, and this can still be the actual soul and heart of What If. What If is horror inspired a lot of the times. It's willing to ask difficult questions and take a look at uncomfortable and difficult situations throughout the history of comic books that could have gone very, very differently, often leading to the death or worse fates for a lot of beloved heroes and the way things could have been. I'm interested to hear what you think in the comments down below. Would you have liked to have seen this episode? Would you not? Did you read any of those comics that I talked about, including The Other or the What If one-shot about The Other, or maybe even Spider-Man Disassembled, which now is kind of mocked as a movie, I guess, like Spider-Man going through a change just to promote the movies. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that and what you would want to see from What If Season 2. Are there any storylines from classic What If comics that you would like to see? The sky is kind of the limit on this question and on these stories, so please let me know in the comments down below. Please be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this, subscribe for more content. I will see you in the next one. Have a fantastic day, and as always, everyone, stay shui.